Okay. And I guess you all saw the thing that says you consent to being recorded. So welcome, everyone. This is the premier podcast forum, whatever, of Truth to Be Told with Everett TJ Butcher and myself. And today we're featuring, this is our first podcast of this series. We used to do a radio show together in Westchester called Don't Get It Twisted. And it was a lot of fun to do. And we hit on it, we hit on everything. It was really interesting because our podcast at that time was really, the radio show actually about that time was actually TJ and Dr. Io and everyone educating me as a white person, and just bringing up stuff that everyone didn't know. TJ is a voracious reader, and his point, he's my mentor. We will say that. And today we're going to be discussing policing, and with us we have Carlton T. Myers, II, Esquire, and as founder and head consultant of Myers Strategic Solutions, LLC, Carlton consults with communities nationwide to identify, strategize, and implement long-term and positive change in police practices, policies, and culture through the CAT method to achieve empowerment-centered policing reform. He also leads the Criminal Justice Reform Program at Heartland Alliance in Chicago, Illinois, as a senior policy manager. He's got a long list of achievements here, and since we're only going an hour, I will let that go. And Carlton, welcome. And also with us tonight is, there's Ms. Denise Ash, who works with there's a lot of letters, and I didn't write out what the letters meant, but it's the PSLECAC. Could you, Denise, tell us what that stands for?
It's the Pennsylvania State Police Citizens Advisory Commission. I think that's right, Shay.
Pennsylvania State
Police.
Law Enforcement. There's
Law Enforcement Advisory Commission.
Okay.
There you go.
Nice.
I get the letters confused too, Adrian. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. It's fine. It's fine. It's all casual here. Carlton, I'd like to start with you because I know you have some ideas on policing, to say the least, and give us a start.
Oh, okay. Did you want me to talk about some of Pennsylvania's stuff, or just kind of my general idea?
Give us some general stuff on why you would be so good to give Pennsylvania some ideas.
Okay, yeah, definitely. So I guess what I'll do is I'll start with, I know we're talking about reimagining public safety in the era of a post January 6th, right? So I think we have to talk about what happened on January 6th, right? We saw for the first time, at least in modern day times, the Capitol was taken over by a bunch of white supremacists explicitly. I believe that, some people might argue that it's already been taken over by white supremacists implicitly. But, I'm talking about what happened out loud. I mean, we saw the Confederate flag being waved inside the Capitol for the first time ever in the US's history. And I mean, we also saw people try to actually go after and potentially assassinate elected officials who have a lot of power, especially those who are Democrats. Now, in my opinion, out of all of that, I think that's important. I'm not trying to put it down. For today's conversation is what I'm honing in on is the fact that we know that a lot of those individuals who participated in that day's events of trying to have this attempted coup of our government were actually off-duty law enforcement officers who work in different states and municipalities and who left that event and are right now patrolling the streets of their own jurisdictions. So when we consider that and we look at what's happened with, George Floyd, the Derek Chauvin verdict, Breonna Taylor, Ma'Khia Bryant, Daniel Prude, Jacob Blake, the list goes on, right? One thing that we know for a fact is that regardless of law enforcement themselves being white supremacists or not, the way that law enforcement is used in our society is essentially as a weapon of white supremacy and white privilege. And when we talk about white supremacy and white privilege, that is not something that is solely owned by white people. Okay, there are a lot of people of color who also have privilege. And to be honest, this has actually been argued in front of the US Supreme Court for actually centuries, really decades, definitely centuries, I believe, where there have been actual Supreme Court jurisprudence interpreting what does it mean to be white in our society. And that means if you're white, you also receive the privileges and protections of being considered white. Now, I know that there was one case where there was a gentleman who was from India, and he was making the case that because his ancestry originated from the Caucasus Mountains, which is where the word Caucasian comes from, that is what made him white in American society. Now, the Supreme Court ended up deciding against that because that, of course, is a more scientific interpretation of what being white is, right? But they instead said it has to be the science plus the way that an everyday average person who would just see you on the street, what would they think if they looked at you? And so I just want to say, these are like fluid terms and fluid ideas that really come down to relativity and a matter of, how you interpret it. But at the end of the day, the privilege itself is tangible. When you have it, no matter what race you are, okay, you have it and you use it. We hear this all the time when we hear about law enforcement being called. When you didn't do anything wrong, we saw what happened with the incident in New York City with the African-American gentleman who was doing bird watching. And then there was a white woman who ended up calling the police on him for no reason, really. And we've seen this in other cases. And so what I focus on, just considering all of what I just said, is the fact that there's a power disparity that exists in our communities, okay? A power disparity between law enforcement, who are there to serve our communities, and between community members whose taxpayer dollars pay for law enforcement salaries and pensions. And at the end of the day, if a community member, does something that's considered a quote unquote furtive movement, right? You just kind of scratch your shoulder when you're in front of law enforcement. If they see that as an imminent threat, they can kill you, use deadly force, and get away with it. And they can also not be held civilly liable because of qualified immunity. And so what I focus on is how can we empower those in the community who are disempowered when it comes to public safety? And there's a lot of ways to do that, but what I do is I provide a process through the CAT method you mentioned earlier, which consists of community empowerment, C for community empowerment, A for accountability, and T for transparency. And understand that the crux of that method is that community members, especially those who are from those neighborhoods and zip codes in the community where there's high levels of negative police interactions like racial profiling, excessive use of force, sexual misconduct, those community members especially need to be involved in, need to have knowledge of, and need to have at least 50% voting power. I'm gonna repeat that, at least 50% voting power over all police activities that are directly related to police-civilian interactions like stops, searches, uses of force, surveillance technology, the way protests are handled, military-style equipment, etc. And when we start including that perspective and that methodology into what I call the fundamentals of every employment. I don't care if you work at McDonald's or you work for JP Morgan Chase. Every employer cares about these things, hiring and promotions. They care about their policies and the development of those policies and the modification of those policies. They care about the training of their employees, and they care about discipline, because what do you do if your employees do something they're not supposed to do, or if they don't do something they were supposed to do? Every employer focuses on that. The problem is that with law enforcement, that focus, typically the boss is who determines what that is. But in our society, that is the exception for law enforcement. Taxpayers do not decide what those fundamentals are for law enforcement. Law enforcement decides what those fundamentals are. And hopefully at times, lawmakers decide that as well. But a lot of times they don't. They allow law enforcement to do as they want. So what I focus is on, how can we change that dynamic so that community members, especially those from those communities with those high levels of negative police interactions, are embedded into these fundamentals of law enforcement employment, into the hiring and promotions, into the policy development and modification, into the trainings. We're hearing a lot about that now, right? With Derek Chauvin, and like use of force trainings need to be revised. How can we do that? Well, this is how. And the discipline, right? I think, Denise, I imagine the work you do focuses on the civilian oversight when it comes to discipline of law enforcement. So, what I'm saying is, how can we make sure that it's not just discipline, but it's all of these other areas that community members have at least 50% voting power? So that's my idea on how we can do this. And there's several ways of doing it. I look forward to talking about how that's already been done in America, especially this year here in Illinois, the work I did with the Legislative Black Caucus to make that into a reality by making it into law.
Carlton, this is TJ. You brought up the policies, imaginative policies. Could you expound a little bit on when we're thinking of policies, the difference between the funding of the police versus reform versus abolition, different perspectives on what these policies entail? Could you kind of give an overview of the difference of those three perspectives?
But before I do that, I want us to really focus on what that question that TJ, or at least the framework he just put out there, what is that really addressing, right? We're talking about defund, we're talking about reforming, and we're talking about divesting. I mean, however, which way you want to see it, right? At the end of the day, the reason why the defund movement became so strong, this is not a movement that was new in 2020. This movement has existed since the 60s at least. But the reason why it grew in so much strength in 2020 was because after Breonna Taylor, after George Floyd, after Daniel Prude, after Jacob Blake, and everybody else before that, Black and brown people and white people and Asian people, everybody got fed up of seeing these videos of these lynchings of people of color. And they felt disempowered because it's like you're watching it, but you can't do anything about it. And so the whole point of defund is to take power away from police by taking away their money and instead reallocating that money into the community resources like youth services, reentry services, mental health services, substance abuse, addiction services. Once again, like I said earlier, it's about the power disparity, right? How do we get power to those who are disempowered? Now, that's one way of doing it. That's one way of doing it. My whole thing is, I believe that there's other ways of doing it. It does not have to be done by defunding police completely or even defunding them like, not completely, just a bit. I think that at the end of the day, that decision needs to be left up to the community. Each community is different, it has a different relationship and history and culture with their law enforcement, which needs to be respected. So I believe that if you come at community members with a process that helps them figure out, okay, for our community, what is it we want? Number one, right? Do we want to defund? Not every community wants to defund. And if we don't want to do that, what else would we want to do? And how do we go about doing that? And that's the CAP method. It helps you to figure out what is it you want to do, and then how do you do it so that you can then implement it.
So I know here in Montgomery County, of the municipalities that have police departments, an average of 35% of their budget is for police. So it could be anywhere from, I think, a low of 15% to a high of almost 50%. So if you're living in a little town and or a borough, a lot of that money that is collected in your property taxes goes to fund the police. So add that into the fact that right now we're in primary season, and all those local officials are up for election. It's up to all of us to hold them accountable. Do we want to, if someone is very happy with the police and the community isn't, is that really the person you should be electing? So there's that whole aspect to it. I think when people say defund the police, they think it's from, like up on high, and don't realize it's really being funded on a local level.
And it's another thing that people don't realize about defund police, which even the defund people don't realize. And I talked about this in a presentation I did on YouTube on the intersections between policing reform and environmental justice, is that there's actually a lot of private sources of funding for law enforcement that are not subject to public oversight or public input, because the money's not coming from the municipal budget. The money's not coming from the state budget or even the federal funds, right? And this is money that's coming from private sponsors through police foundations, okay? This is something that's important. And I think everybody here, you should probably go on Google and look up to see if your police department has a foundation, and look and see who's on the board of that foundation. Because when you see who's on the board, that's going to give you an idea of who is providing money to your law enforcement agency through private funding. In other words, they're donating money as sponsors to the police foundation for the police foundation to then provide as a donation to the police department, to go toward efforts like trainings on use of force and firearms that the community may not be in agreement with, to go towards surveillance technology that the community may not be in agreement with, to go towards purchasing military style equipment, all kinds of stuff that at the end of the day, this is one way that police are able to do this behind the back or behind closed doors. And community members have no way of knowing this is happening or who's pulling the strings behind it. I can tell you right now, a lot of, yep.
That's the T part, the transparency.
Transparency, right. And so one thing I could tell you is that environmental justice advocates, you can see a lot of articles on this. What they've found out is that it's actually a lot of fossil fuel companies, utility companies that are behind, that are on the boards of these organizations. Also, retail businesses like Target and like Apple, all these big names, and also local universities. And so when I started looking at this, like just across the board in different police departments in the country, I noticed the same police departments that have board members from universities and businesses and tech companies, all and banks, all that stuff. These are also cities that also have a lot of gentrification that's happening at a pretty fast rate within them. And when you look at who's benefiting from the gentrification, it's the same businesses and academic institutions that are on the boards of these police foundations. So, you got to look at where's the money coming from? It's not just from the municipal government or state government. It's coming from private sources that are influencing the behavior of your law enforcement. Now, when I talk about community empowerment-centered policing reform, I'm talking about, like what Adrian just said, transparency, making sure that that kind of information is known to the public. That should not be something that is a secret from the public when taxpayer dollars, once again, I'm gonna bring this up, taxpayer dollars are paying for law enforcement, their salaries and pensions. Why do we not know this information? Why is this information not accessible on your website? That to me is a problem, and that is disempowerment. So it's all about how do we change that dynamic to create something that is more equitable, right? Where everybody has power.
How do we find that out? Just Google your police department?
If you Google your police department and say, give me an example, like Philadelphia, let's just say Philadelphia. Philadelphia Police Foundation, Google that, see what comes up. If they have one, which I bet you they do, they're a big enough police department, they probably do have one. You can then go on their website and look up board members. Like they'll usually have some place where they'll give you a list of their board members. You
Yeah, in
click
the
on
about
that,
section.
and then you'll see who they are. And usually they'll give you, like, they'll tell you who they are, and they'll give you some background on who they work for, what their position is at their employment, all of that stuff. So this is important because, when we're talking about defund, a lot of times defund people are usually focused just on public municipal budgets and state budgets. Like, let's see the police budget, but you're not talking about the privately sourced money. We have to include all of it. We want a comprehensive view as a community of what's going on with our taxpayer dollars, okay? And how are you using it?
And then there's also the money that comes in from, what's it called when they take your property if they arrest you?
That's almost like a tax assessment when if you don't pay your taxes and they just take your property. Mm-hmm.
Okay, it was confiscated.
Right.
Susan Duncan had asked about are these lobbying groups? It seems like you answered that question there. But one question I'd like to bring that up, Carlton, was in view of what you were saying, and that goes back to the policies again. And when we're talking about reform, some are talking about abolishing the policing, and then reforming coming underneath. But it seems like when we're talking about reimagining, the focus now is on the policing itself, whereas just as in your project you did before when you were doing the born suspect, and where we were dealing with perceptions are given, as in New Jim Crow with Michelle, where she taught from that way, and where there were those that were disproportionately incarcerated, and we had recidivism going on. President Obama had the policy that he had. Now the focus is changed. Seems it's changed from that aspect of the incarcerated, mass incarcerated, now to the policing itself, the policies within policing. So in that regard, again, what I would want to ask is those that are talking about abolishment and then reforming, how do we put this in perspective of where we are focusing in the movement within, where now the citizenry has more of the say than these groups, as we're calling on these lobbying groups, of where the focus is?
So, I mean, what I would say is I would look at examples of where this has already happened. I would look at Burlington, Vermont. I've actually been, I used to live in Vermont. So I've been in touch with a lot of my colleagues in Burlington. They've already defunded their police department. I think they're the only municipality that has actually successfully defunded their police department since George Floyd's death. So the way that they did it, once again, it came down to the CAP method. It came down to community empowerment centered policing reform. They had a public safety committee that consists just of community members, especially those from the areas in Burlington that have high levels of negative police interactions. They were the ones that worked with the city councilors and with the law enforcement department on, number one, amending the municipal charter. So that way now community members did not only have the ability to oversee civilian complaints, but they also had the ability to determine hiring and firing of officers. And so they actually had power. It wasn't just about them reviewing complaints and providing a recommendation. It was like, no, we can hire and we can fire, and we can also determine what your capacity limits are at the police department. That is huge. I know it sounds like the former president, but it is huge. Most civilian oversight agencies don't have anywhere near that power. The only other jurisdiction I know of that's had power like that for decades now is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Their Fire and Police Commission has had the ability to fire and also to hire law enforcement for years. Matter of fact, they have so much power. Last year, they demoted their police chief at the Milwaukee Police Department that ultimately resulted in him getting, terminated. So, oh yeah, and I see President Royal from the Milwaukee branch is on the call, just gave a thumbs up on that. That's what's up. Either way, I just want to say that, Burlington, Vermont is the only other community outside of Milwaukee where I've seen that happen. But they did it not to reform their police. They did it to defund, to abolish, ultimately, their police department. So essentially, they're already doing what Minneapolis is still trying and still struggling to do since George Floyd's death. And what I've noticed there is that, you know, Burlington, like I said, each community is different. There's no one size fits all approach to policing reform. Burlington is a community that has a very counter culture that exists in their just overall culture. They don't have the same level of crimes as like Chicago, where I live. You know, they don't have that kind of crimes there, or even New York City, where I grew up at. They don't have that level of crimes, or Philadelphia. They don't have that in Burlington. So in my opinion, defunding their police department could probably work out pretty well for them, considering all of those factors: counterculture, culture, and their crimes are not the same as they are in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, etc. So I think for them that could work. Another place that's also doing it, they just started doing it actually, is Ithaca, New York. That's where Cornell University is located. I saw their mayor on Al Sharpton's show last week talking about how their city council, through a community empowerment centered policing reform model, right? They brought in all the community members from everywhere to work with law enforcement and the city council and the mayor's office on deciding, are we going to reimagine public safety? Yes. Okay. How are we going to do that? What does that vision look like for us? They created the division, and now they passed it into law, and it's going to start happening. Okay. So they're going to have, instead of one police department, they're going to get rid of it and now have two different divisions of public safety. One large division of unarmed public safety employees, and then a smaller division of armed public safety employees. And they're going to have all kinds of rules and stuff in place. Like I said, the fundamentals of employment, right? The training, the hiring, all of that. They're going to have all of that in place through a community empowerment centered model of developing the process, right? How are we going to do this? And that's what Burlington did as well. So to me, it's not really about like defund or not. It really comes down to, at this point, we need to start looking at reimagining public safety as not some kind of blanket one way of doing it, which is what I feel like Obama did with the 21st century policing, and what Trump continued to do with law and order policing over the past 4 years. It was like this one size fits all approach. We need to do away with that. It's obvious it doesn't work, okay? The science even shows that. The data shows that. And Campaign Zero, mappingpoliceviolence.org, they'll show you the data on it, that it does not work, all right? That's like, what's his name? DeRay McKesson. What we do need to look at is what does work. And I believe what does work, and this is from the work I've done with TJ and with Adrian in Pennsylvania, the work I did even I've done with President Royal in Milwaukee, the work I've done with Sonia, who's also on here in Fort Walton, Florida, President Janetta Williams over in Utah. Each one of them are amazing advocates doing amazing work in their local communities. But even if they do the same thing, like let's say body-worn cameras in each one of their communities, it's going to look different, because each one of your communities is a different community with a different history, different demographics, different culture. And that's the way we need to start reimagining public safety, is a rainbow, a kaleidoscope of difference and variance and diversity, but all of it under the umbrella of equity and community empowerment. And so that's why I'm saying, like, it could be defund, it could be 21st century, it could be law and order, it could be divest, it could be something very different. That's not up to me to decide. That's up to that community that has to live in that community to decide what their vision is for reimagining public safety. And all I do is provide a process and guidance on utilizing that process. Because right now, this one size fits all approach, it has not worked. And that's what the data shows us.
Can we ask you this though? This imaginative perspective from what you see, and I taken this from the judicial and the legislative. With legislation come up as in with the Floyd the Floyd proposal for a bill that's coming up legislatively wise, and with HR 1 from the civil aspect, it would take that along with the judicial. But do you foresee, just like what happened in the Tenney decision, when that went before the Supreme Court, how can we get past that? Because in the Tenney, that decision basically came down just like when you talk about white privilege. I don't call it white privilege. I call it ill-conceived entitlement, where they said we don't have to regard this. And basically what you're saying is we're giving the civilian task force, if you want to call it per se, jurisdiction and empowerment. Legislatively and then constitutionally, will that uphold without laws like the George Floyd laws being passed, or HR 1? What walls do you see would have to be overcome to make this imagination of policy change happen?
And so for me, okay, just to make that happen, what I think needs to happen, well, number one, you're talking about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes, yes.
So, well, I mean, okay, number one, I'm just going to be for real with you, because I have a lot of my colleagues in DC are actually working on this, and like they've been in touch with me about it. They've actually put out a lot of letters in the public. You could Google it and see like what they've been saying about it. Number one, before I even say that, in my opinion, just based off of what I just told you about how now we need to reimagine public safety to be a diverse kaleidoscope, right, of difference and variance based on your particular community. In my opinion, because of that, federal advocacy, federal law cannot and will not lead the policing reform efforts going forward. I'll be honest with you. If you think about it, what's happening right now with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, we've been here before, at least twice before in America. The first time, at least to my knowledge, I'm a young guy, so you know, some other people might know even further back than that. They probably would. I'm also not a historian like that, but I can tell you, at least my memory is the first time it happened where we had like an omnibus, big package bill of policing reforms in it, was in 1968. That was when Lyndon B. Johnson was president after JFK's assassination.
And when I graduated high school.
And at that time, that's when I think the Kerner report had already come out. I believe, I could be wrong, but I know it was around that time. And LBJ had passed into law. I forgot the name of the law, but it was like the omnibus something legislation that essentially established like federal laws and standards around policing. That's where the idea of officer friendly and like the PALs, the police athletic leagues, that's how all of that got started, was money coming from that omnibus legislation that was passed into law by LBJ in 1968. Then about 20 something years later, we had the notorious 1994 violent crime bill that our current president authored and that Bill Clinton signed into law. Now that's the bill, as we all know, is responsible for some good things like the Violence Against Women's Act. It's what provides the Department of Justice with the authority and power to initiate pattern of practice investigations. It also created the COPS office in the DOJ, the Community Oriented Policing Services Office, to really help build community police relations all throughout the country through grants. However, we also know that it funded a lot of states in introducing and passing into law essentially a continuation of war on drugs legislation like 3 strikes laws and others like that a lot of African Americans to this day are still incarcerated because of those laws that were on the books from back in 1994 and on. And so that was the next bite at the apple for some kind of omnibus federal legislation. I just kind of laid out to you how both of them, we already know the officer friendly, the PAL stuff wasn't as helpful as we needed. It didn't prevent police violence. It did not hold law enforcement accountable who were engaging in misconduct. And now we have 20 something, once again, years later, right? 1994, now we're in 2021. It's like a little bit over 20 years now. We have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So there's a pattern here of like, no matter what the federal government does on policing reform, it's never able to address the underlying issues and problems and systemic problems of law enforcement. And to me, the reason is because policing is not a federal national issue. It is a state and local national issue, all right? It's something that needs to be addressed through state legislation and through local ordinances, and also through those community relations on the local level, especially. In my opinion, I think that that's why the defund movement was so successful, because those movements all grew out of the community. They grew out of local efforts. They did not grow out of national efforts. And it ended up becoming a national effort, but it grew from the bottom up, not from the top down. And so I think that we need to look at what the defund people did, Movement for Black Lives and others did, and even what NAACP did back in the day with the anti-lynching campaign, which is really where the defund model got that from, right? From NAACP's anti-lynching campaign back in the day. But I think we need to look at those strategies to really think more about, hey, it's great if the federal government gets some stuff on the books, especially related to like a national registry of officers who've engaged in misconduct and something on licensing. That's great. But we really understand state legislation needs to get passed to get this addressed, and the right kind of state legislation. We also need local ordinances initiatives to get this stuff done right. And that's, in my opinion, the role of the federal government should be, how can we take this money that we have, that we usually give to law enforcement and to municipalities to do this work? How can we start to shift our paradigm, our way of thinking on it, and give the money to the community groups on the ground, not the national organizations. I'm talking about the state and local groups that are getting good work done on the ground and just need funding to continue doing good work. I think that's the role that the federal, state, and local governments can and really should play right now. And I think that's what's going to lead to success.
Barbara McNeil asked a question, and she wanted to ask you, is there any effort for DOJ to force police agencies to collect and analyze comprehensive data related to police encounters with the public in return for all the federal funds?
So right now, I believe under the George Floyd Act, there's some language on that where there would be some data collection, analysis, and public reporting requirements around use of force in particular, which is based on a bill that Senator Cory Booker had introduced years ago that I had lobbied on. It's called the Pride Act. Either way, that's not done yet. What is already done though, all right, is that the FBI under the Obama administration, they had actually gotten an initiative up and going through the FBI. This was all through executive action, because Obama's the head of the executive. He was able to do that without having to go through the legislative process. They created what they call an FBI use of force database, where essentially police departments around the country are on a voluntary basis can provide their use of force data to the FBI, and the FBI will populate that data on this database that is already accessible to the public. All right. So that way, instead of police departments themselves having to create a website or add that to their own website, they can just have a link on their website that if any community member clicks on it, it's going to direct them right to the FBI's use of force database, where they can look at what the data is on use of force for that law enforcement agency, in addition to every other law enforcement agency that is voluntarily providing that data. So to me, the way to kind of make that more mandatory rather than voluntary is to do what we did here in Illinois. Just to let y'all know, I worked with the Legislative Black Caucus in Illinois last year through this year on their policing reform legislation called the SAFE T Act, the word safe hyphen the letter T Act. And what it does, just one thing, is that it requires that all law enforcement agencies in the state of Illinois have to report their use of force data to the Illinois State Police. That is the state police agency for the state of Illinois. At that point, Illinois State Police have to collect all this data, and they have to provide all of this data and their own use of force data to the FBI use of force database. Now, it's also required under Illinois' law that that data must be broken down by race, gender, age, and location, at least, and also has to have information on if the civilian who the force was used on, were they armed, were they unarmed, was the officer armed when they used force, what kind of force did they use? All of that information must be captured and provided to the Illinois State Police, and they have to provide it to the FBI use of force database. That is required by Illinois state law now. So when we talk about how can we translate the local and state efforts into the federal efforts, that's one way to do it, through state legislation. Make a requirement that law enforcement agencies have to report that data to the FBI, and they have to break it down by race, gender, age, and location.
So one of the things that an hour is not going to be enough. We're going to have to do a part 2. But there's some questions in the chat that I would like to get to, and I would also like to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we had in conversations. So Blessing asked about, are there examples of defunding working in suburban communities? For example, Lower Merion High School, there's a psychologist, a social worker, and a therapist in-house instead of police in schools that help fuel the school to prison pipeline. And someone else asked another question. Yeah, Lee, who has had to go to another meeting, said that we should not have the police in schools because that lends itself to the school to prison pipeline. And I know in Montgomery County, in the juvenile division, most of the kids, 2/3 of the kids incarcerated are kids of color. So you can see how that goes on from there. But we talked about something that I really wanted to bring up, and that is, we talked a little bit about how some people were saying the blue wall kind of crumbled a little with Derek Chauvin, but we were then going back and forth, and you said that it really hadn't crumbled, and I said, well, what if the police were the ones that had their finances on the line? Like a civilian gets hurt, they sue the police department, we all pay for it through our tax dollars, and the police department just goes on its merry way. But if that money came out of the police budget, then they couldn't get their raises, they couldn't get their benefits because of the behavior of some of the officers in the department. Wouldn't something like that help with accountability? And you also talked about getting them insured and things like that.
Yeah, so I'll be honest with you. In my opinion, when we talk about police accountability and we talk about justice, you know, everybody's been saying with the Derek Chauvin guilty verdicts a couple of weeks ago that we did receive accountability, but we didn't get justice. It's kind of like, now that we got these verdicts, what's next, right? And to me, if you're going to talk about what's next, you have to talk about policy reform, because policy reform is how you go about establishing long-standing reforms, as opposed to like a short-term, you know, kind of Band-Aid type of reform. We want something that's actually going to address a long-term problem through a long-term solution. And in my opinion, when we talk about police accountability and justice, we have to make sure that everything, you remember I talked about earlier, the fundamentals, right, of employment of anybody, right? When we talk about law enforcement, those fundamentals, everything, we talk about hiring, promotion, policy development, training, discipline, everything should connect to one thing. And that one thing should be the decertification or the certification, the license of a law enforcement officer. So a license is essentially the same thing like, you know, like a lawyer has to get a license in order to practice law, so on and so forth. That is what gives a law enforcement officer authority to be able to, number one, have a firearm and use a firearm as a police officer, meaning that if they use deadly force, it can be justifiable, meaning that they will not be held liable criminally for committing certain acts. And a lot of times, as we know, because of qualified immunity, civilly liable as well. That's all because of the authority they have as a law enforcement officer. A regular civilian would not have that same type of authority necessarily. Now, of course, some states have stand your ground laws, so that would make it a little different. But for the states that don't, a civilian typically would not have that ability to just kill somebody and get away with it, all right? Law enforcement do, though, because they have that license, and that license is what gives them the authority to do that. So what we need to focus on is how can we take away, once again, the power, the authority of law enforcement by connecting everything to it. And I would say the best example of that is what we've done here in Illinois with the Safety Act, that law that we just got passed. I believe that it has one of the best decertification processes in the country. And I'm going to tell you why right now. I'm going to real quick just run through the process with you. So when I say decertification, like I said, I'm talking about taking away a police officer's ability to be a police officer, their authority. In Illinois, under the Safety Act, there's two big things they did that I like a lot. One thing is that they created two different processes on how to take away a law enforcement officer's license. One process is called automatic decertification. What that means is that if a police officer is found guilty of, pleads guilty to, or pleads nolo contender to committing any of the felonies or misdemeanors that are listed under the law that can get a police officer decertified, have them take away their license. Those are specific felonies and misdemeanors that are listed. If they commit any of them, okay, they can automatically lose their license. Now, the way that would work would be, okay, so that's one thing. The other way is what we call discretionary decertification. Now, discretionary decertification means that a law enforcement officer would lose their license, not for committing a criminal action necessarily, but for committing something that's not criminal in nature, but still unethical, okay? Still immoral for the badge. And so, for instance, under Illinois law, under the Safety Act, discretionary decertification would cover, for instance, police officers tampering with body-worn camera footage and or equipment, or even directing another officer to tamper with body-worn camera footage or equipment. Also, it would cover if an officer did not intervene, like we saw in the George Floyd incident, when those officers did not intervene. It would also cover if an officer does not render aid. Once again, we saw that with George Floyd, right? And with Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And then it could also cover excessive use of force. It would pretty much cover anything that is not necessarily criminal, but still can be considered immoral enough and unethical. Now, the fact they have these two different systems means that they have now expanded the scope of what makes an officer eligible to lose their authority, to lose their license as a police officer. The other thing I like that they did that I think speaks directly to community empowerment centered policing reform is that now under the Safety Act, community members, regular civilians, instead of having to file a complaint with your law enforcement agency, if an officer, let's say that an officer, you're a victim of excessive use of force by a police officer in your community. You go to your police department, you file a complaint, you have to go through the complaint process. If they find that the complaint is substantiated, then it'll go through the internal disciplinary process at the police department, which usually is not open to the public. At that point, if they still find that the officer did engage in misconduct, then the onus is now on your police chief and or sheriff, if it's a sheriff's office, to then report that to your post commission. In other words, your peace officer standards and training commission, who's responsible for the license and revocation of license for all law enforcement in your state. Now, in Illinois, we've changed that. We've essentially cut out the middle entity being the law enforcement agency. So now if an officer engages in excessive use of force, you as the civilian, instead of going to your police department about it, you go directly to the post commission and you file a notice of violation of certification with them, meaning that an officer violated their license. And when you do that, what's going to happen is that the post commission will investigate it. The way it is under Illinois law, they'll appoint two officers who don't have any actual or perceived conflicts with the accused officer and or with the law enforcement agency of the accused officer. They will have 7 days to investigate the issue and then provide what they call a summary investigative report and any corresponding evidence to the post commission. Now, something else that's good under the Safety Act is, let's say the post commission's like, hey, we don't want to investigate it, we're too busy. Well, guess what? Guess who else can investigate it under Illinois law? A civilian oversight authority. Denise, I'm talking to you, so that's right. So a civilian complaint review board, right? Or even an inspector general's office under Illinois law can also investigate the notice of violation of certification that has been reported by a civilian, not by a police chief, not by a sheriff. Now they can still investigate it if a police chief or a sheriff does, but now under the law, it could even be a civilian, okay? So there's now several different ways that civilians are directly engaging with the decertification process. Therefore, civilians are empowered to hold individual officers accountable to take away their authority, their license, right? Disempower, right? Take that away from them because they've engaged not only in committing a criminal act, but now it could even be for non-criminal acts. That is huge for the country because that is now the gold standard that other states can now say, hey, we want to do that. Let's copy and paste what they did. Let's custom tailor it to our law and our system. And now we're doing the same thing. That's how this stuff happens. It's like a domino effect. So I just wanted to put that out. There's more details to it, but I just wanted to say just initially, right off the bat, Illinois is the first state in the country to allow a decertification model where you have that much civilian engagement. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention. Remember when I said that civilians can now directly report to the Post Commission about a notice of violation of certification? Well, guess what? They could also do it anonymously. All right? You can do it anonymously, and it still has to be treated the same way if you didn't do it anonymously, and still treated the same way if a police chief or a sheriff were to file a notice of violation of certification. That is huge. No other state in the country allows for that. And this is what I'm talking about. We got to start looking at, like Maryland, they got rid of their law enforcement bill of rights. That is huge. We need to start looking at what's happening on the state level. And in my opinion, look at that more than looking at what's going on in the federal government. I'm sorry, but I just feel like what's going on in the federal government right now is like looking at a clown show. I mean, it's like constantly back and forth, something new, something comical, something not. It's like, come on, you guys can't get your act together. So you know what? We're going to do it here on the state and local level because we understand how serious it is that our people are getting gunned down, are getting killed without accountability all over this country. We're having public lynchings happening of Black people all the time, and it's been like this. This is not new, but the video is out there. So it's like, if they're not going to do it, we're the taxpayers. It's our responsibility to do it for our communities.
So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening, I know, in Pennsylvania right now. I know 2 bills passed and the governor signed them into law last year, requiring police officers to disclose their employment history, which would be something if they were decertified in another state, we would know about. And the other requiring officers to undergo regular mental health evaluations. There's also a bill that Representative Kaufman introduced that he's calling the gold standard. And I know Carlton took a look at that, and I think we're somewhere maybe brass, not quite gold on that. And I did ask him to join us, but he had another previous appointment.
Gold plated.
You go. That's yeah. Something with the Sentinel team. But I want to ask Denise. I'm finally getting to you, Denise. What her role is as a member of Governor Wolf's Pennsylvania State Law Enforcement Civilian Accountability Committee or something like that.
Right.
You're going to have to unmute. Denise.
What I'm going to do, I'm going to read you the commissioner's purpose, which is public information on the website on what it is, and it's an executive order, and it's order 2020-04. And the purpose of the commissioner is to improve policing practices within the law enforcement agencies under the governor's jurisdictions. To achieve this the purpose, the commissioner will focus on promoting transparency, fairness, and accountability among the Commonwealth state law enforcement agencies by examining events, conducting reviews of policies, practices, and procedures relating to the use of force and bias-based policing, and make recommendations for implementation of corrective actions. So we have just started. We will have our first quarterly meeting on May the 20th.
Next in 2 weeks. So is that just oversight for the state police, not for like local police, or is that all police?
It's a state police review committee, and I'm not gonna, I don't know all of the details as far as.
But it's really new. It's really new.
It is new. We are under the leadership of the Inspector General, who is one of the individuals who's on the call. but the whole layout is in place. We've received training, we've gotten information, and we will review cases that are brought to our attention. And also, I'm on a committee to help review any racial bias information that comes to us. But it is the Pennsylvania State Police.
Will the
Okay.
meetings be open to the public?
Yes, they are. And I believe the May 20th one information may already be on the governor's website. If not, it will be there shortly. So you can go on the link and do the Zoom meeting, which is we have an executive session prior to the meeting on the 20th.
Okay, that is, well, that's a step. But finding out from Carlton all the steps that we can take locally is really interesting. I think I'm going to have to get the Illinois bill and post that up and send that out to our legislators here in Pennsylvania, because as Danielle pointed out, if we do something on a local level, the state could then come over and overrule it, just like when Philadelphia had passed some gun restrictions and the state said, oh, no, you can't. So there does have to be some stuff. There does have to be stuff on all different levels. I'm going to go through the chat again at the end. And if there's any questions that we didn't,
Is there one thing I can just drop in here about qualified immunity?
always.
Okay, I just want to make a point about qualified immunity, because I know right now people are thinking that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is going to get rid of it, and it's not. So if you have hopes in that, please divest yourself of that, because that's not going to happen with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I mean, to be honest, a lot of Democrats are not in support of getting rid of qualified immunity. People tend to focus on the Republicans, but a lot of Dems are very pro-police and don't want to get rid of it. So it's not going to happen, but that's not a bad thing, right? I think, like I said, we can't look to the federal government on getting this stuff done. They have a clown show going on up there, okay? We have to look at what's going on the state and local level. When we look at what's going on this year alone, and even last year on qualified immunity, we know Colorado passed their policing reform legislation last year, which they were the first state to actually get rid of qualified immunity for law enforcement. Now, what they did, they required that every law enforcement officer needs to have required, okay, mandatory personal insurance for no more than $25,000 per officer, okay? Now, I'll be honest with you, I think it's great to have the insurance requirement, similar to, like, you know, having car insurance. In order for you to be able to drive a car legally, you have to have insurance. If you don't have insurance, it doesn't matter whatever else you got. You're not going to be able to drive it. You'll get in trouble. I think that's a good idea, but the $25,000 personal liability, that's not good enough, okay? Here in Illinois, there was a bill that a member of the Legislative Black Caucus introduced last year that called for a requirement of at least $100,000 per officer and police chief and sheriff, that they have to have that insurance for themselves, no less than $100,000, which I think is better, because if you look at the research that's been done by the Cato Institute, that's like one of these right-wing conservative institutes that does a lot of work on criminal justice reform. They did a bunch of research on qualified immunity over the years, and it showed that in cases where officers were not able to use qualified immunity as an affirmative defense when they were held, you know, they were being sued in civil court for misconduct. In those cases where they were found guilty and they had to pay out, right, a large sum of money, officers only paid out on average about 0.02% of whatever the total sum was that they were supposed to pay out. The remaining amount was paid out by the municipality. In other words, taxpayer dollars. And a lot of times the municipality would reimburse the law enforcement officer for whatever money they paid out, that 0.02% of the overall money. So to me, if you think about it, most law enforcement officers are not making like big time paychecks. They're making maybe 30 to like 60, 70,000 a year, okay? And on the higher end, not that many, okay? Most of them are on the lower end. How are you gonna even like have somebody pay out $1 million. I mean, we're hearing 17 million, 27 million in these lawsuit settlement agreements with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Just think about a fraction of that, $1 million. One individual officer is going to have to pay to a family for engaging in misconduct that led to the death or severe injury of their loved one. How is that officer going to do that? In civil court, there's a term that lawyers like to use for an affirmative defense. It's called being judgment proof, meaning that according to your financial records, you are not able to reasonably make this payment. And so the court will then have to determine, do we even hold you accountable for that payment? Do we have to create some kind of installment payment plan? Or do we just reduce the amount of payment and have you pay pennies on the dollar instead of the dollar on the dollar, okay? So that's what ends up happening in these instances, because officers don't have the deepest pockets when we're talking about misconduct and liability. But you know who does have the deeper pockets? The police departments, the law enforcement agencies. And so, TJ, this goes back to what you said earlier about defund and abolish. One tactic that can be used when we're talking about qualified immunity is to do what most other employers, you know, the kind of liability that they face, which is called vicarious liability, meaning that if your employee, while they're within the scope of duty of their job, like let's say you're McDonald's, you're an employee, you're mopping the floor, you don't put a sign up letting people know this floor is wet, be careful. People walk over the floor, somebody slips and falls, they crack their head open. Well, guess what? They're going to sue the employee, but because of a term called vicarious liability, there's a whole bunch of other legalese I'm not going to mention on here, like other terminology I'm going to mention. But essentially, what that does is say that if your employee within the scope of duty and does something negligently, you as the employer can be held liable for the employee. So that means that an attorney is going to sue the officer, and they're going to sue the police department. And they understand that the officer can't afford the majority of what's going to be owed, which is why it's good to also have the police department also a part of it, because they do have the resources. They do have the money to pay out. We all know that. These budgets are so bloated, they have the money. So the idea is to instead to defund police by really tying in the individual misconduct of officers directly to the police budget, right? And if you tie in the insurance requirement by saying that, okay, we require officers like Colorado to have insurance. So if it's like a Kim Potter, like a Daunte Wright incident, where she pulls out a firearm instead of a taser and says, taser, 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 shoots him, most law enforcement officers are going to back her on that. They're going to say, hey, stress under the job, split second decision. She was negligent, no doubt. It was wrong, but it's not Derek Chauvin, all right? Like, she wasn't trying to intentionally kill him. They have an argument to make for that. Okay, I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's an argument, and they can make that. In that kind of circumstance, let's say that they win that argument. So now here she is, she has insurance. She's now being sued in civil court for $1 million. Just using an example, probably more than that. She's like, I can't afford that much, but my insurance covers $100,000 of whatever the payment is. She gets knocked for the $100,000. Her insurance premium goes up. She keeps her job, okay? Let's say she does it again. Once again, it's a negligent incident. I didn't mean to do it, split second decision. Now she gets knocked a second time. At this point, the insurance company drops her from the insurance plan because guess what? She's too much of a liability, okay? Too risky for us to cover her. So now, in order for you to have a license as a police officer, it's a requirement for you to have insurance. The same way that in order for you to drive a car, you have to be insured. So if you don't have insurance because you've been dropped because of your individual misconduct, then now you lose your license. And so that's where the individual liability plays in, right? And then I also talked about the vicarious liability for that. Now this is how the police department has to pay out. So we have two different ways of accountability: individual with the insurance and the decertification. And then we have the broader, more systemic, right, liability with the police department having to now pay out because of vicarious liability. Instead of just getting rid of qualified immunity, we get rid of sovereign immunity as well. So in my opinion, I think that's the best way to go, especially considering the defund movement, considering being in a post-Trump, post-January 6th era, where we know that there are law enforcement who are white supremacists, who are planning and actively, deliberately going after Black and brown people and killing us and using the badge to get away with it. This is how we can get them and we can fight back. And this is how we can empower the community. Like I said, Illinois' decertification process has several different ways that community members can engage in it. And I hope that that's a model that other states try to replicate, because as these officers get dropped off their insurance plans and now they can be decertified, who makes that decision? Is it police policing police, or is it the community, law enforcement and civilians working together as one community to support public safety and ensure police accountability through more so proactive rather than reactive strategies? That's what I'm talking about. So this is already happening. This is not novel. It's just, how do we replicate it so that it can happen in more places?
So
this is why you're my brother from another mother. But it's ironic that in Pennsylvania, a state constable who has to get certification, they don't have to be certified, but if they want to act along with the sheriff's departments and all, and with the magisterial district judge, they have to be bonded and insured. But yet our police don't, individually, like you were saying. My other thing that you brought up there, and what I love, is this could be universally made a universal code of conduct under civil rights, violations of civil rights. The DOJ could do that if they wanted to, but like you're saying, it's not going to be done. But it would take us to push laws legislatively to make this happen. It's not a hard fix if it really wanted to be done. Michelle Alexander, New Jim Crow, she brought this very up from that aspect. I just wanted to throw that in there to let you know that making is in Pennsylvania. It can be done. They already do it to the constables. Why not do it to the police?
So we've already gone 10 minutes over, and we're starting to lose people who have other meetings to go on to. And I would, if you guys have any questions that haven't been answered, I'm going to leave the chat open for a teeny bit. Please put them there. I'll get those questions answered. We will be doing a part 2.
Definitely.
This will not be the end of this. And I really want to thank Carlton for coming, for Denise and everyone else that showed up. And we have to work in our communities. And right now we can find out from our commissioners who are running, our the mayors in the boroughs, the council members, to find out from them what their feelings on the police accountability are. So if Carlton, you have any final words for us?
Yeah, I do. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I just did CT mayors2, MAYERS 2 @gmail.com. And please do reach out to me if you're interested in learning more about the CAP method and community empowerment centered policing reform. I do offer trainings. I have PowerPoint slides I do where I train communities on the CAP method, and I provide also illustrations of how it can be applied to, for instance, body-worn cameras, how it can be applied to surveillance technology. All of these issues that right now are pressing issues for communities around the country that, I'll be honest with you, the federal government, they're not really trying to address it. So it's really, the onus is upon us to own our communities and own the work in our communities. And so what I would do is love to work with you on how I can help you to do that through a process. This is all about establishing processes so that it makes it easier to be able to create what you are already envisioning in your own imagination for what you want to see in your community, how you want to reimagine public safety. So it's all about the process on how you go about doing it and then implementing it. So my email's in the chat. Please do reach out. And I look forward to part 2. And I'm sure we'll have more to talk about. Hopefully by then, we'll have more news about the Justice and Policing Act. And we'll see if it really has teeth, or if what I'm hearing is true and it's just going to be like lipstick. It's going to look good, but have no substance.
So,
Alton, I'm gonna be calling you for some focus groups and all, so
Okay.
you're gonna be sorry you gave me your email address.
All right, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right, thanks for reaching out.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
so you'll be able, if you missed parts of this, you came in late, you had to leave early. This will be posted up on my YouTube channel. All you have to do is Google YouTube and Adrian Seltzer. Here also is my email address for anyone who wants it. And you can get in touch with us. You can give us ideas for future shows. And I thank you everybody for showing up. I know that a lot of people get zoomed out, and that's why I try and keep it to an hour, knowing full well it's going to run over. But yes, and Everett's CCMC State of the Unity forums.
We'll post it there too.
Yeah. So
State of the Unity Forum. This was terrific. Thank you so much, Adrian and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.